Welcome to Lecture 6-1, Needs Assessment. In this particular lecture, I'll be discussing the concept of needs assessment itself, concept of needs, and the first few steps involved in conducting a needs assessment, which I refer to as planning of a needs assessment. Let's begin by considering just what are needs. The major questions I want you to think about are: who defines needs? What is the role of legitimacy in defining needs, and against what or compared to what are needs defined? Now, we are all familiar with this concept of needs in our daily life. And many of us, I guess because we're simply human, have a difficulty in distinguishing between needs and desires. We need to be very careful about that and think about this in the context of a politically or socially defined need, which of course raises the question of what does that mean to define a need politically and socially. To a certain extent, to a great extent in fact, that depends on who is doing the defining. In the study of public policy in general, which includes policy analysis and program evaluation, one of the most important distinctions that's often made is in terms of the legitimacy of a need. Much research has been done on this topic. Who is defined as being a legitimate group to ask to have a need taken care of by society is certainly a big part of that. Early in American history, at least until the end of the 19th century, the attitude in society, by and large, was that people who had not enough to eat, no roof over their head, things like that, people who today we would define as having genuine and legitimate needs, had arrived at those circumstances by and large as a result of their own errors, maybe in the case of children, the errors of their parents. But in any case, those kinds of needs were not, at that point in time, defined as legitimate needs, at least not in terms of needing to be addressed by society. So this brings up another role, or another question in this topic. Part of this definition of political needs depends on who is addressing those needs. Certainly, if you follow politics very much, presidential elections, congressional elections, or city council elections for that matter, you will know that politicians, political parties, people in general, disagree on the role government should play in addressing certain needs. So we can think of the legitimacy question in terms of the legitimacy of the recipient, but also in terms of the legitimacy of the intended provider. So some needs are perceived as legitimate, needing to be addressed by government itself, while others are perceived in a different light, possibly as legitimate in terms of being provided for by private agencies, which certainly is a part of what we're studying in this class. We are not only talking about government programs and government policies, but programs and services that are provided by private, nonprofit agencies. Finally, this question of against what are needs defined. So again, by against what, I mean compared to what. This brings up the notion of benchmarking. Benchmarking, in general, is about finding a yardstick by which to define needs and to measure needs. There are two different aspects to this. The definition of them would certainly involve defining whether or not something is needful, as well as defining the different aspects of that need. Measuring the needs refers to literally trying to get a handle on the level of a particular need, level in terms of quantity, or level in terms of the quality of the need, or the quality of the kinds of services that might need to be provided. In the text you will have read about 5 different types of benchmarking that are used to help us to define and measure needs. The first of these benchmarks is referred to in the book as in terms of theoretical frameworks, theories. Now remember again, what we're talking about with a benchmark is a tool, an outside reference point against which we can compare what we observe to determine if there is a need, if that need is legitimate, if it can and should be met by some organization, whether or not that organization is public or private. So this first type of benchmark, referred to as a theoretical benchmark, includes, for example, this very broad type of theoretical model that you see on your screen right now, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You may have been exposed to this idea in another class, perhaps in an undergraduate sociology or social work class. This is essentially was an effort to develop a hierarchy, a set of an internal ordering to this set of needs. Maslow argued that, at the minimum, people have physiological needs, or physical needs if you want to call them that, for air, food, water, sleep. Once those needs are met, we can move on to addressing safety needs, needs for stability in our life, consistency, being physically safe. Moving beyond that, we have needs for belonging or love needs. Now that sounds like something that maybe we shouldn't be addressing in this class, but in fact it is. We're talking about acceptance in a group, acceptance in society. Support networks are a big part of this aspect of needs. And developing support networks, we have recognized for decades now, is an important part of the provision of many programs out there. Everything from youth at risk for drug abuse or delinquency, gay, lesbian, and transgender youth, drug and alcohol rehabilitation programs, suicide prevention programs. Many of these kinds of programs have a component in them to address these exact sort of needs, as well as the fourth level there, the esteem needs, needs for respect and recognition. And finally, what Maslow referred to as self-actualization needs. Needs for knowledge, self-fulfillment, peace. Now, most programs will not have these necessarily, especially in the last couple of categories, stated as needs that they are going to address. These things would perhaps show up as techniques within the program, as different sorts of program activities to address these kinds of needs. But typically, a lot of programs will sort of turn this on its head, and look at things, for example, like group acceptance and respect and knowledge as means to another more direct and measurable end, typically defined in terms of physiological needs or safety needs. So that's a case where the theory or in this hierarchy kind of gets turned on its head. There are certainly other kinds of theoretical frameworks and models that are used to assess needs. For example, traffic flow models, weather models. The book talks about models of alcohol consumption. You can talk about models of the occurrence of obesity or diabetes or other health problems in a given group. What we're talking about here is typically in situations where we can't literally go out and measure a thing to assess the need for it, but we can develop predictive models about how much service, what kinds of services, and at what level services will be needed. Something very, very simple in terms of traffic flow models and weather models and the interaction of them. Think about trying to assess the needs for snow removal and snow removal equipment. Four other sources of benchmarks are mentioned in the chapter, and I want to briefly discuss each of them. On the screen, you'll see these four mentioned, four listed in terms of the titles used by the authors of your primary textbook. They refer to moral and ethical values, services provided to others, service provider opinions, and client recipient opinions. I've kind of rephrased these as questions to help you think about what kind of information you would be seeking to create these benchmarks. So the first one of these is, what ought we do? So here we're talking about moral and ethical values. Just want to point out to you to think about. Many organizations out there are based on moral and ethical frameworks. In the nonprofit sector, these types of organizations abound. In the U.S., mostly these organizations are Christian, but not exclusively. There are certainly religious-based organizations based on other non-Christian religions in the United States. Again, they're not as abundant as the Christian-based ones, but there are many of them out there. And a final note, organizations that are based on moral and ethical values and thus would be prone to thinking about using a moral or ethical framework to assess needs need not be religious-based. I'm thinking of, for example, organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union that certainly have an ethical framework underpinning the organization itself. How about the what are we doing question? Here we consider as our benchmark, as our comparison, what is happening in other jurisdictions or with other similar populations to service needs. This comes out of the contagion model of service provision, where what we're talking about is oftentimes particular kinds of services, particular kinds of, let me rephrase that, particular kinds of needs will be recognized in one jurisdiction or another and spread from that jurisdiction to other jurisdictions without stereotyping too much. For example, we can think of places such as California and New York as sort of hotbeds for innovation in these areas. Many programs will typically start in some of these larger cities where the opinion makers of our society tend to congregate. And as that happens, the kinds of services that they provide will be picked up on by people in other jurisdictions. Furthermore, think about it this way: jurisdictions compete. Different places, states, counties, cities, compete with each other, not necessarily in terms of how much they can do for their people. Certainly politicians and potential political office holders talk about those sorts of things, but cities and states compete against one another to attract businesses, to attract development. Think about this in terms of quality of life sorts of things. So these kinds of comparisons, basically keeping up with the Joneses, what's my neighbor doing, become important sources of benchmarks as we do needs assessments. Service provider opinions. What would we like to do? Who better would know the big picture regarding what is needed than those providing the service? But you have to be aware of two things. First off, people who work in an organization providing a service have an agenda. That agenda, of course, is keeping their jobs, to put it as basely as it could possibly be put. You will have talked about this in other PA classes. It's certainly a topic of discussion in the general theoretical understanding of how organizations function and organizational behavior. People want to protect their jobs, and thus, when asked directly, what would they like to do? Well, of course, they will answer that question in terms of, well, we could be providing this service or that service. There's a need for this service or that service out there. Oh, and by the way, my organization is just the one to provide it. So the second thing to remember here is that they also have built-in biases. Service providers, people working in an organization, will tend to see a given problem and will tend to define a given problem in terms of their own organization. A very brief example of this. Think about drug addiction, drug abuse, drug policy in general in this country. What is the basic problem there? Is the problem that we have drugs coming into the country so we can stop them at the border and be okay? Is the problem that we have people selling and pushing drugs? Is this a problem of law enforcement? Or is it a problem of addiction and illness and sickness? These people are addicted to drugs and should be dealt with through social work kinds of programs. How you see the problem, and thus how you see the needs, are biased. People have biases built into them. What they see out there depends on where they sit, where they work, what they do. Finally, client-recipient opinions. It's almost embarrassing to say this question for last, but oftentimes it is, unfortunately, the question that's asked last. What do people want from us? And again, this takes us right back to the whole question of legitimacy and distinguishing between needs and desires. But it is an important benchmark, and we will spend a considerable amount of time in this chapter talking about how to survey clients or service recipients as a method of collecting data for a needs assessment. Shown on the screen now is the performance management cycle. You may recall seeing this in the first chapter of the text. This is a simplified version of it. The purpose of this particular simplified version of the picture is to show the places in which needs assessments might occur within this performance management cycle. Needs assessments are done for many reasons and in many contexts. Given that this is a cycle, there's no real starting place in it. We can start at any point in the circle. But typically we would start, or oftentimes we would start in terms of program development. Needs assessment plays a very important role in program development. And again, remember, what we mean by program development is actually designing a program to address given needs. Well, you can't really address given needs until you have defined those needs, assessed those needs. Of course, once that's been done, the program is being implemented, there might still be an opportunity to do needs assessments as part, literally, of the program evaluation and performance measurement process. Needs assessments here would focus on how are needs being addressed. Not really an example of what we've been talking about in terms of program evaluation so far, but it is an important component of program evaluation. We've been addressing the idea of program evaluation as basically trying to prove that the program produces outcomes, produces desired outcomes. Well, sort of the flip side of that would be to go out and say, well, not only are we interested in determining if the program is producing outcomes, but let's take a look at what those outcomes are and how they measure up against some benchmark, needs in other words, and see if there is still a gap. This can be a good impetus then for trying to modify the program or add to the program or develop new programs. And in fact, that's where the arrows in our performance management cycle would take us, back up to strategic planning. Strategic planning, again, refers to the overall planning done by an organization, which, of course, every organization has goals. Every organization from General Motors to the Jonesboro Public Housing Authority has goals, and they engage in strategic planning, basically trying to decide how to allocate resources to achieve their goals. And again, needs assessment can be part of that. Needs assessment about the organization, needs assessment about the organization's goals, what kinds of needs are out there, and what needs to be done to address them. One way to think about that figure, one way to think about figure 6-1 is to think, in fact, about the goals of the assessment itself. There are a number of possibilities here. To obtain funding for a particular program or organization, whether or not that program already exists or is proposed. To address a perceived problem, in which case we have to ask ourselves, who has perceived the problem? Or perhaps to improve the level of existing services. Those three questions tie very directly into figure 6-1. Obtaining funding for the program might be part of strategic planning or part of program development. Improving the level of existing services is part of evaluation, but can be one of the goals of a needs assessment. The textbook spells out 8 different ways, or 8 different steps in addressing needs assessment, 8 things that have to be done. I'm going to focus on the first 3 here. Essentially, my questions about goals and stakeholders and access to resources tie into these 3 steps of the needs assessment process. These first 3 steps I would lump together and call planning the needs assessment. So we have to plan. A number of questions come up here. As I've already mentioned, first off, what are the goals of the assessment? This is very similar to asking or becoming familiar with the political context. Now notice I've modified this a little bit. The textbook says become familiar with the political context. I would say become familiar with the political context and the administrative context. It's sometimes hard to separate those two, but by the political context I'm really referring to values and goals, things like that, and the administrative context I'm referring more to the power structure of the organization and how that organization relates to other organizations that provide similar services or that provide funding to the organization. So you need to become familiar with that. And again, to repeat my earlier statements, you want to ask yourself questions like, what are the real goals of this assessment? Is it to obtain funding for a program that already exists? Is it to obtain funding for an organization that already exists, but for a program that it is not yet offering? Are the goals of the needs assessment to address a perceived problem? In which case, the question becomes, who has perceived the problem? A very important question to ask. Are potential clients out there clamoring for additional services? Or is this a case where the bureaucracy itself, the organization itself has said, we can expand our services? Typically, that kind of language is going to be couched in terms of because there is a need, but oftentimes it's because the organization wants to grow. Many times it's because the organization knows that there's money out there to address a particular need, and the organization wants to tap into that funding. For example, the U.S. federal government supplies billions and billions of dollars to states and localities as well as to nonprofit organizations in the form of federal grants. Many of these grants are done in the form of a competitive application process in which basically the federal government says, we have set aside a certain amount of funding to address a particular problem. So in this case, the federal government or policymakers in the federal government have perceived and defined a need and made some money available. And then they said to state and local governments and nonprofit organizations, prove to us that you can address this need. Prove to us that there's a need for this particular thing in your area, in your political jurisdiction, and we will give you some money to address it. So existing organizations are certainly aware of that. They're looking for money. So oftentimes, the ways that these needs get defined, the driver behind the needs assessment is actually funding. What's available out there. The kind of money that's available is going to affect whether or not something gets noticed as a need and defined as a need. And of course, it should go without saying that who defines the need depends or affects how the need becomes defined, and affects the likelihood that the stated need will ultimately become transformed into a perceived need and ultimately receive funding to be addressed. Once a need has achieved the level of being identified as a target of block grants or categorical grants by the federal government, the story's over. The only interesting thing at that point to play out is who's going to get the money and exactly how they're going to use it. And that certainly, as I just got through talking about, is a driver behind what organizations do, be they public or private. If the need is being stated by potential recipients of a service. People who, say, for example, have a disease, then that's going to make a different political context for the definition of the goals of the organization and of the goals of the need assessment. So this takes us into talking about stakeholders. Identify the users and uses of the needs assessment, as McDavid and Hawthorne call it. My question to you is, who are the stakeholders? Obviously, figuring out who the stakeholders are would be helpful in identifying the goals. What we're asking ourselves is, who is requesting the needs assessment? Who is guiding or shaping the needs assessment? Who is funding the needs assessment? And finally, who is conducting the needs assessment? You can easily get 4 different answers to those 4 different questions in terms of who's requesting it, who's shaping it and guiding it, who's funding it, and who is conducting it. When you get multiple answers to those questions, obviously you have multiple stakeholders. You're almost always going to have multiple stakeholders in a needs assessment anyway. Minimally, stakeholders will be the organization, people and offices within an organization, and the clients or recipients of the service. When you have multiple stakeholders, you need to ask yourself, do they share a common set of goals for the needs assessment, or do they have conflicting goals? So right away you can see how identifying the users and uses of the needs assessment ties us back into the political and administrative context of the needs assessment. These are not separate questions. They need to be addressed together. What do the stakeholders expect to get out of the assessment? Do they want answers to questions they have? Or do they want data in order to prove a point? How specific or general are the areas of interest? Is this a comprehensive assessment, or is it focused on a particular subset of needs, or even a particular subpopulation in a broader population? So here that also brings in question number 3, identify current and potential target populations. This is going to be important for the needs assessment overall in deciding what kind of data you need to collect, but it's also important just as you're planning the needs assessment. Different organizations out there will address the same population, perhaps in terms of different needs. But, for example, there's a large overlap between the homeless population and people who are addicted to substances, people who engage in substance abuse. So if you have a target population of homeless, then you probably need to consider how that ties into redefining that population as it overlaps with the population of substance abusers out there, which takes us back to the political and administrative context and the users and uses of the needs assessment. Again, these questions are all tied together. Finally, you need to be aware of potential challenges to the actual conducting of the needs assessment and to the acceptance of its results. Needs assessments are very contentious because they affect very directly the allocation of money. As I've already pointed out, the billions and billions of dollars that are available through federal grants, federal and state grants, by and large depend on proving there is a need in a particular jurisdiction and that need can be addressed by a particular organization. So right away you can see how this is going to be a political and administrative hot potato, that it's going to be a very contentious kind of process. Furthermore, because of the importance of the different kinds of benchmarks that are being used or possibly being used, there's an additional level of difficulty here, or additional level of contention. McDavid and Hawthorne point out on page 213 a couple of the things you should be aware of, and I'm going to quote here. The provision of there's some reasons that acceptance of the needs assessment might prove difficult, or there might be challenges to actually even conducting the needs assessment. And they give the following 2 reasons. The provision of the service is wrong, or a poor use of resources, because the objectives of the service are different from or directly challenge strongly held values or existing commitments. So what are we talking about there? We're talking about how the money gets spent. Follow the money, as the old saying goes. So people will challenge a needs assessment, the need for a needs assessment or the results of a needs assessment, based on these kind of ethical or financial challenges to allocating resources to a particular service. Another argument that's often made is that the needs assessment itself is flawed. The information produced is biased, inaccurate, or incomplete. Now, of course, the purpose of taking this class, the purpose of me talking about needs assessments here, is to help you understand how to avoid those kinds of challenges. So we're going to be talking a lot about how to design a needs assessment, indeed how to design any evaluation, such that it's not flawed, such that the information that is produced is not biased or inaccurate or incomplete. This is going to lead us, and we'll have a couple of other lectures in this chapter, onto the topic of sampling as a part of needs assessment and questionnaire design, which will be discussed in other lectures. Another important question to ask up front has to do with access and resources. What sort of access will you need to collect the data? Who and what agencies or organizations will need to cooperate and assist? How long will the assessment take? What is the budget available for the assessment? Will you need to hire a consultant to help you do the assessment? Again, what I'm trying to do here with the last 10 or 15 minutes is help you to understand those initial steps in conducting a needs assessment, which I have termed planning the needs assessment. The 3 steps that McDavid and Hawthorne refer to: becoming familiar with the context, identifying users and uses, identifying current potential targets, I think can equally be addressed as thinking about goals, stakeholders, and resources. Now at this point, I want to introduce a new step. This is not really something that is addressed in the textbook, but something that I think you need to think about. And that is the creation of a needs assessment team. I want to recommend this to you for several reasons, many of which tie into the topics we've already been discussing. There is a difficulty in obtaining buy-in to doing the needs assessment or buying into the results of a needs assessment. It's, as I said, politically contentious. The stakes are very high with regard to the allocation of money. Unlike evaluation itself, unlike what we've been talking about for most of this class, needs assessment is often not mandated by a funder as part of a program. Most of those federal monies I've been talking about earlier in this lecture, as well as private money from private foundations that are given to organizations to carry out programs, have as part of the requirements the need to do an evaluation of the success of the program, of the success of the policy. Needs assessment is not so often built into these things. So you're going to have a harder time getting this stuff done. You're going to have a harder time getting it accepted when it is done. So the sort of the basis for doing needs assessment, or the major requirement for doing a needs assessment and having it accepted, is more about political skill and leadership rather than a mandated authority. This has to be done because the people who are providing the money do it say we have to do it. The latter one is true about evaluation, but not often true about needs assessment. Finally, needs assessment requires a very broad range of information and skills. Perhaps not that much broader than doing evaluation itself, but again, that broad range is coupled with these other aspects that I've been talking about. So let's take a few moments to consider what it means to establish a needs assessment planning team. Depending on the purpose and scope of the assessment, you need to begin by identifying individuals who should be involved in the assessment team. The first step that you should take is establishing a team leader. The team leader will pull the larger team together and direct the needs assessment process. This may or may not be the person in the organization who is responsible for evaluations. It's tempting to say that evaluators make good assessors because they have a very similar set of skills. But oftentimes, people who serve in evaluation capacity are hired based solely on those set of skills and may not have the kinds of political skills or connections, the kind of administrative skills and connections that are really needed to pull together an assessment team, to get the assessment off the ground, and to get it accepted when it's done. So it's worth thinking about, should the person who is leading the assessment, not necessarily conducting the assessment, but should the person who's leading the assessment really be the person in the organization who's generally responsible for conducting evaluations. Secondly, make sure the team is comprised of individuals who have a variety of skills or knowledge and who can actively contribute to one or more aspects of the needs assessment process. For example, you want people who have the ability, have the authority to request and obtain data. People who have resources and access to data. Very important possible team members. People who have the ability to analyze and synthesize data. In other words, somebody like an evaluator. The ability to prepare a report and develop action items. The ability to act on the results once the action items are identified. In fact, one of the best ways to get buy-in to the assessment process is to include decision makers or representatives of decision makers from different organizations or from different parts of a single organization on the assessment team. They will have a stake in it. They will feel they have some control over the process, some control in the conclusions that come out of the assessment process, and be more likely to buy in at the end. So, as I say, the ability to act on the results is an interesting and good criteria to use as you're selecting team members for your assessment team. Finally, in terms of this second set of things, the abilities of people, you want to get folks who have an ability to represent a unique perspective of all the impacted groups. So this really takes us into talking about the diversity of backgrounds. You want people who work in the system, who will be involved in implementing the changes based on the results of the assessment. So that might include administrators, might include line staff, what have you, depending on the particular topic of the assessment. And you want individuals who benefit from or impacted by the services. What I mean here is, of course, former, current, or potential service recipients, community stakeholders, community members. I include this to point out to you that in creating a needs assessment team, you want to get people from both the inside and the outside. People with different perspectives on it, different needs, even different goals. And getting them to work together on defining what the needs are, in assessing the needs, and in drawing up conclusions in a report of the needs assessment team means that those different backgrounds and people from those different organizations in different areas, different walks of life, will feel that they've been represented in the process and be much more likely to accept the conclusions as they come out of the needs assessment. All right, you've reached the end of this lecture, Lecture 6-1. As I've already mentioned, there are several other topics to be discussed in this module. So please proceed to listening to those other lectures.